Good evening, I'm Lynette Clementson, Director of the Wallace House Center for Journalists.
And I'm Kate Cagney, Director of the Institute for Social Research and Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. And I just want to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about ISR. ISR is the world's largest academic social science survey and research organization. With a commitment to advancing our understanding of human behavior, ISR conducts rigorous, objective research that draws on the expertise of over 300 scientists and 1,200 staff members across a range of disciplines. Our work explores complex dynamics that influence society, some of which we'll discuss tonight, but that includes the behaviors and attitudes of the American voting public.
So we're here together tonight as co-sponsors of this event because our work is dedicated to encouraging research and fact-based dialogue. We'd like to thank our other co-sponsors, the Ford School of Public Policy, the Year of Democracy, Civic Empowerment, and Global Engagement, and Detroit PBS, who will be broadcasting this event next week. So the Institute for Social Research houses the American National Election Studies, which for 75 years has been surveying the beliefs and behaviors of American voters. One data point that if you read the webpage for this event, we called out, is that there's a question asked consistently about trust in government. It's important to note that in 1950, 80% of respondents to that question said that they had trust in government. Do you know what the figure is today? 20%.
Yet in the midst of that decline in trust, some young voters are becoming more engaged. 78% of University of Michigan students on the Ann Arbor campus voted in the 2020 election, up from 60% in the 2016 election. And in the 2022 midterms, our University of Michigan Flint campus was recognized for having the highest voting rate at any public four-year institution in the country, with a 50 to 59% student voting rate and impressive turnout for midterm elections.
Woo, you and Flint.
Yeah, I know, you and Flint.
So as you entered today, you passed, and I hope that you stood and talked with the students from an organization called Turn Up, Turn Out, which focuses on nonpartisan civic engagement, voter registration, education, and turnout. We want to thank our students who are here tonight for their incredible work to get students and members of our community out to vote.
And I'd like to turn your attention to your programs. So in that program, you'll find an acknowledgement to and thoughts from our supporters of tonight's event, James S. House and Wendy Fisher House. Jim House is a distinguished professor of sociology and public health, professor emeritus of the Survey Research Center at ISR, public policy and sociology. His wife, Wendy Fisher House, is a community-based psychotherapist.
At a moment of deep polarization, the Houses have faith in the power of science, research, and journalism to reach people and foster dialogue and understanding. Jim and Wendy, we're thankful for your support. Thank you. So because the goal tonight is to foster informed engagement and dialogue, we've saved quite a bit of time at the end of the evening for questions from the audience. At 7 p.m., our moderator will shift to all of you. We'll bring the lights up and invite you to come to the microphones. There are microphones in each of these aisles, just behind this front section. And for those of you who can't easily get to one of the microphones, if you'll look at the programs you picked up when you came in, on the back, you should see a QR code. Am I right? It's on the back? You can submit your questions using that QR code. We have two Knight Wallace Fellows, Sarah Rahal and Laura Santanum, who are sitting here waving their hands in the fourth or fifth row there. They'll be following the questions coming in with QR codes, and we'll make sure to include everyone in the conversation.
And I'll just add that the Q&A section is meant to focus on the Q part, right? So for questions, so we're asking that you keep your questions focused to allow time for others to engage in the conversation and to have more back and forth. We are academics, after all, broadly, and so sometimes we like to be expansive. Yes.
That's so diplomatic. With that, it is our pleasure to welcome out our panel for tonight's conversation. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our panel for tonight, Bret Stephens and Lydia Polgreen of the New York Times, María Elena Salinas, former anchor, longtime anchor for Univision and currently of ABC, Vince Hutchings, political scientist here at the university, and our moderator for the evening is a voice and a face that's probably familiar to many of you. Stephen Henderson, first and foremost, is a University of Michigan graduate. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, host of the daily program Created Equal on Detroit Public Radio, and longtime host of American Black Journal on Detroit PBS, which, as I mentioned before, will be airing this conversation next week. For people who couldn't make it out tonight, we hope you'll encourage them to watch next week. So with that, Stephen, we'll turn the evening over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette, and of course, thanks to everyone who's here, and of course, to our esteemed panel here. I promise that this will not be a discussion about the horse race aspect of this. I think we're all getting enough of that every day, whether you're looking at Twitter or Instagram or the 24-hour news channels. But I do want to start with our panelists talking about the state of the race as they see it right now. We are 13 days from Election Day. The polls are, I think, confusing to some. They're intriguing every day. But I'd love to know, given the attention that I know that our panelists are giving to every quarter turn of the campaigns and what people are saying, just how they see things, how they see things shaping up. Bret, I'm going to pick on you, and you're going to go first.
Oh, great. First of all, an honor to be here in Ann Arbor at the university, an honor to sit with all of you. I think it's an unhappy race in an unhappy country. I think that many of us feel that we wish not only the candidate on the other side, but the candidate on our own side were someone else. I think there is more fear connected to this particular election than even 2020 or 2016, which I thought were high watermarks in terms of fear and polarization in the country. I think each side of the country thinks that if the other half wins, it's somehow, in one form or another, the end of America. I happen not to think that, but this is typical. If you look back at historical analogies, this is, I'd say, typical of eras that precede major political, social unrest. Not just the 1960s, but go back to the 1850s, when people have fundamentally different conceptions of what America ought to be about and who gets to govern it.
Go ahead, Lydia.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having us. So I spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent, living abroad, and I have the very common experience of being overseas. I also spent much of my childhood living abroad, of being overseas when an American presidential election is happening. And so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to talk about this a little bit from that perspective and hope that it'll bring some illumination to what's happening in this country. So I've had this range of experience experiences. Like, I remember during the 2012 race, I was in Zimbabwe. And forgive the cliche, but I was talking to the taxi driver who I'd hired to take me around. And I was absolutely floored by the comprehensiveness of his knowledge of the Republican field, because there was the primary had still not been settled. And he said, well, you know, what do you think about Rick Santorum's policy about this? Or, I'm curious. He just had this incredibly detailed knowledge of what was happening in the U.S. election. And I'd had a lot of experiences like that, and when you're a New York Times correspondent in another country, everybody wants to know what's going on in America. And you sort of feel silly saying, I live here, I don't know. But you're sort of seen as an emissary, as someone who can maybe explain it. But always there was the presence of this curiosity. So I was just recently on a reporting trip in Dubai, of all places, and at a certain point, and this was just a few weeks ago, a certain point it occurred to me that literally not one person had asked me about the U.S. presidential election. I asked a few people about it. Were they thinking about it? Did they, and literally they'd be like, oh yeah, that seems like a real mess. Good luck, So, and then on my last night in Dubai, I was at a dinner party, and there were a bunch of different kinds of people there, and it was a little bit of a sing for your supper kind of situation. I sort of thought, okay, finally it's going to happen. They're going to ask me to pontificate about the U.S. election, and they did. And then, I talked for a couple of minutes, and then we just moved on to another topic. So why am I telling you this? I guess I think that what it looks like to me and what it feels like to me is that we are in this really intense, inward, backward-looking moment as a country, and the rest of the world knows it. They see it, they sense it, right? And that feels very sad. It feels potentially quite dangerous for us, but also for the rest of the world. And so that's what's been on my mind as I think about this contest. We have two presidential candidates who have very, very different visions of what this country should be. And that's quite scary. But I don't know, I feel that the rest of the world not caring about this election tells me something powerful too. So I'll leave it there, but yeah.
I wish some of our citizens would be as informed and as interested in the positions of the candidates as your taxi driver in Zimbabwe, because it seems like not too many people are informed, and I think that's one of the most important things when you're going to a voting booth is to be an informed and educated voter. So if you ask how I see the status of the race right now, in one word, tense, and scary also. So I have been here for many years covering elections. I've covered 10 presidential elections in the US, some in Latin America too, but here in the US, this will be my 11th. And I focus usually on the Latino vote because I worked for decades in Spanish language media. And our interest was always just to get people to go out and vote and be interested in voting. And in every election, just like Bret said, sometimes your team wins, sometimes it doesn't, right? It's just like a game. And then the next day you're disappointed if your team didn't win, but you go on. I think since 2016, I saw for the first time the fear that you were talking about, especially among the Latino electorate. And I think that has only gotten worse with time. But a lot of things have changed, and it makes me very uncomfortable and very worried to see the deep divisions that we have in our country, how there are families that are divided, there are friends that don't talk to each other. I mean, throughout the years, I don't know about any of you, but sometimes your group of friends ends up being the parents of your kids' friends. So I have this group of friends in which I'm the only journalist. And every time there's a big news story or election time comes around, they always come and ask me, so what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? But this year, no one has asked me anything because and I live in Miami, by the way, So no one wants to talk politics because there's just these very deep divisions, and it really does concern me, because we don't see the divisions only in Congress among our politicians and the parties, and Congress not being able to agree or pass any legislation. We see it among the electorate. We see it among people. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, because I think you mentioned this, that the day after the election, no one's going to be happy, or half of the country is going to be happy, but it's going to be very tense. I think no one right now would dare to predict who is going to win, because the race is so tight. I don't know what to believe anymore in the polls, because we have seen polls work and some polls get it all wrong. But the truth is that the day after the election, there's going to be people that are going to be not only disappointed like they were in the past elections, like my team lost, they're going to be angry, they're going to be scared. And I don't think that's healthy for any of us.
Vince, of course, your work is, as an academic and researcher, kind of studying how the electorate presents itself before and after elections through polls and other measures. Give us a sense of what you make of what we're seeing right now, 13 days out. The polls are close. There are people who say, you can't believe what some of the polls say. There are people who say, well, the polls are probably going to be pretty close. Give us a sense of how much faith we should be putting in what we see about what people are predicted to do on November 5th, and why that's so.
Well, absolutely. I'm happy to be here on this panel, first of all, with this distinguished group. In answer to the question, I mean, it's obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but just by way of my own kind of academic training, I'm a survey researcher by training. So I very much believe in public opinion polls. I believe in the science behind public opinion polls, and my whole career is based on the utilization of that science. But I also recognize the limitations of survey research and public opinion polls. And by that I mean that there is a imprecision associated with the process. It's not an exact science, as it were. And in a country so evenly divided, there's only so much that the polls can tell us. In a way, we're asking pre-election polls to tell us two things: how various parts of the country express their preferences for president, but also their propensity to turn out. And so the pollsters have to forecast on both of those dimensions. Who do you support, and are you going to turn out to vote? And it turns out that both of those are very hard to do. So what we're currently experiencing in this election cycle is just the difficulty and the inherent imprecision, especially in an evenly divided country, of election forecasting. It's just not an easy thing to do.
Can I
yeah, go ahead, Bret.
add to that? You know, because it at least appears to be a 50-50 race, it disguises a lot of movement in the electorate, which is really interesting and I think makes the job of polling that much more difficult. And it used to be the case that you could reliably expect north of 90% of the African American community would be voting Democratic. Those numbers seem softer. Movement in the Latino community as well. It used to be the case that working class voters voted Democratic, right? That has shifted in part because the identities of the parties have shifted, along with a correlation between levels of education and party affiliation. So what appears to be this kind of 50-50 country actually masks, I think, a lot of movement that's very difficult to predict. Polling doesn't just rely on phoning people up and saying who you're going to vote for, because you know that pollsters can't get to representative samples. So there's some modeling in terms of, well, what do you expect the turnout to be in this community or that? But that now is really difficult to do. So I think the polls could be accurate, they could be spectacularly wrong.
Vince, you have talked about the predictability of the electorate, not the polls, but that elections and their outcomes tend to be more predictable than we think they are. I guess make sense of that given what Bret is saying about this movement and that reliably Democratic constituencies now seem to sometimes vote Republican and vice versa.
Well, there's far more continuity in the electorate, even in 2024, than some of the headlines might suggest. So I think that it depends on what your time horizon is. So in the case of African Americans, for example, it's sometimes it really hovers somewhere between 80 and 90% typically. Sometimes it's a little higher. But it's not necessarily always north of 90%. Sometimes it's just modestly south of 90%. In the case of Latino vote, it's a little bit more volatile. But the point is that for all the various demographic groups who make up the Democratic constituency and the Republican constituency, there's some wiggle room, and there has been for some time. So this doesn't necessarily undermine what Bret is saying, but it suggests that there has always been some variability with the major social groups and how they vote. And that adds to the imprecision of the survey enterprise, or at least the forecasting enterprise. So the groups that are traditionally in the Democratic constituency, they're still there. And the groups that are in the Republican constituency, or at least have been since the 1960s, they're still there as well. Indeed, part of what we're all experiencing, the tension, the anxiety, is a function of what political scientists have recognized as kind of a sorting process, whereby the social divisions in society along lines in particular of race, ethnicity, religion, and sexuality, for example, have now begun to neatly map onto partisan divisions in a way that wasn't true, say, 60, 70 years ago. So obviously the 1960s were a very contentious time, but that description I've just provided wasn't true for the 1960s. There were liberal and conservative Republicans. There were liberal and conservative Democrats. Religious groups and constituencies were apportioned with respect to the two parties in a much more kind of even-handed way than is the case today. Now, in spite of some apparent slippage in some mild direction here and there, the reason, and I'll say this and I'll conclude for the moment, part of the reason we see so much anxiety is that the stakes are so high. And why are the stakes so high? Because a victory for one political party also means a victory for various salient social groups in society, and vice versa. That's not something that was true a generation or two ago, but it is true now, and that's partly what's driving our anxiety.
Well,
Go ahead,
just to do the sort of annoying reporter thing where you follow esteemed academic social scientist with pure anecdote, shameless anecdote. My wife texted me earlier about we live in Chinatown in New York City, and we moved there fairly recently, and just late last year, and I've been noticing the political valence of the neighborhood, because one of the things that happens, we live right next to the federal courthouse and the city courts, right where Law and Order is filmed. You might remember it, dun dun. And so a lot of the Trump legal action has been happening kind of like right outside our door, so it's just been interesting, and I often will see people who show up to support or protest or whatever, and because I'm a journalist, I just like to talk to people, and I'll talk to some of the Chinese American people who live in the neighborhood, and particularly the ones who have arrived more recently, meaning they're maybe first generation as opposed to second or third generation, as many of my neighbors are. They're like, oh yeah, no, we love Donald Trump. He's being persecuted. And so there's this, this sense of like churn and change among kind of more recent arrival immigrants. And so this has been something that's been kind of percolating in the back of my mind. And so my wife texted me this morning, and she said, I just saw the most bizarre encounter. A black UPS driver was talking to a police officer saying, "You're voting for Trump, right?" And the cop's like, "You know it." And then, I mean, this sounds like something that would just be made up, but she's just not the kind of person who makes things up. And she was like, "Yeah." And then this, you know, like Chinese American guy was like, "Yeah, Trump, you know, like 2024, let's go." And I was just like, first of all, they're all men, right?
This is in New York, too, right?
But like this is in Lower Manhattan, like literally in Lower Manhattan. And I think that there is this interesting polarization that's happening, because like, what do these three people have in common? I don't know anything about the demographics of the Chinese American man, but I know that the UPS driver is a, you know, blue collar worker, police officer. They're both men. These are demographics that seem to be trending towards Donald Trump. More recent immigrants, you know, seem to be trending towards Donald Trump in greater numbers than they have in the past. So, you know, I think the lines that we're seeing the polarization happening on gender, you know, age seems to be one of them. And education, you know, blue collar versus white collar. They seem like they're breaking apart in really interesting ways. And I think that some of the strange possibilities that throws up is that even in a deep, deep blue state like New York, you could actually see Donald Trump getting he's not going to win New York, but getting a bigger percentage of the popular vote as a result of, you know, being quite successful with that kind of voter in New York or California or elsewhere. So,
I mean, the question is like, why? Why is that happening? Like I mentioned, I've been covering the Latino vote for a long time, and it's true that usually traditionally they support Democrats. But there's always been between 25 and 30% of Latinos that have been Republican. They vote Republican. The Republican candidate who got the most Latino votes in history was George W. Bush, and he got 40%, between 40 and 42%. So I think that that's what's alarming and surprising a lot of people, because when they say, "Oh my God, Latinos are supporting Trump," no, Latinos are still supporting Vice President Kamala Harris. Between 56 and 59%, depending on what poll you see. Those are mainstream polls, and one of the reasons why sometimes I say I don't trust polls is because there are polls that are done specifically with the Latino voters, and they're done in English and in Spanish. And you have a sampling of about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And in some of these mainstream polls, they only poll maybe 200 Latinos. So that's why sometimes I don't trust the opinion of 200 Latinos. I prefer to see the polls that have 3,000 or 4,000 that they do them in English and Spanish, but those are also similar. I mean, they're still around 58, 59%, and you would say, well, yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot for Kamala Harris. Yes, but that is the lowest in the past 6 elections that any Democratic candidate has of support that has received. And most Latino women are supporting Kamala Harris, but it's Latino men, particularly young Latino men, that, like in other groups, like in African American groups, and like with non-college educated men, they are going towards Trump. And then you try to figure, okay, so why is it? And most people ask me, why is it that Trump's rhetoric, demonizing, insulting immigrants, saying that they are poisoning the blood of this country, saying that they are criminals, that they are rapists, that that's a way of dehumanizing them. Why? How is it possible that Latinos that are either immigrants or their families are immigrants, or their parents are immigrants, or grandparents are immigrants, that they would support that kind of rhetoric? And I think that survey in the New York Times last week or 2 weeks ago is probably, the best answer. There were 2/3 of Latinos that were in that poll that said that when they hear these types of insults towards immigrants, they don't think it's directed at them. It's the other immigrants. And to me, that's surprising, because there's at least, 22 million people in this country that live in a mixed status household. That means that at least one person in the household is undocumented. So mass deportations would mean the separation of families. I can maybe understand how there are more Latinos now supporting a hard line at the border because they don't want to be associated with the chaos at the border. And they're more concerned about an immigration reform that would open the door to the legalization of those who have been here, who have roots, who have children that are US born, that have started businesses. But no, there's more and more Latinos, not the majority, but just in larger amounts, that are supporting both things. Hardline at the border and mass deportation of all immigrants. And this is a shock to me, someone who has covered the immigration issue for so long, because before that was precisely the issue that, or one of the issues that really kept Latinos in the Democratic side, because of that promise of an immigration reform. Since 1986, there has not been an immigration reform, but that promise never materialized. And they don't blame Republicans for sabotaging immigration reform bill every time it goes into Congress, which is what has happened. They blame the person who promised that there would be an immigration reform.
And then couldn't deliver.
And they can't deliver. And that's what happens a lot of times. People don't understand that presidential candidates promise and promise and promise things that are not in their hands to solve, that it takes Congress to be able to authorize many of those things, including tax cuts.
Right.
So I think it's, a lot of this has to do with just uninformed voters who don't know really how the government works, who don't do their research, who go for personalities. At the end of the day, it ends up being a beauty contest, in a popularity contest. And people forget the substance of the positions of each one.
Yeah, Vince, I want to let you jump in there, but I want to inject a small data point that I came across earlier today. Immigration, Americans' views on immigration have been changing pretty significantly. For the first time in a long time, the support for legal immigration is decreasing overall, and the importance of immigration in people's electoral choices is going up. There was a Gallup poll this summer that said an overwhelming majority of registered voters said that the candidate who matched their views on immigration is the candidate that they're going to vote for. So that is a huge issue. Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, excuse me, I'll be brief. I just wanted to respond to the point about being a little bit more skeptical when a particular demographic group, let's say Latinos, represent a small fraction of the respondent pool. That just means we should be more cautious. It doesn't mean that we don't trust the polls. It just means that we recognize some of the limitations when Latinos, who make up roughly 20% of the national population, are only going to be roughly 20% of a nationally representative survey. But that's going to be a relatively small number. So I'm agreeing with you is what I'm essentially saying, that when it's all else equal, when it's a larger survey, assuming it's a good survey, then we can be more confident in the forecasts that are derived from that survey.
I want to stay on immigration for a bit and get Lydia and Bret to weigh in on it. As Maria points out, we are seeing a candidate for president say things that echo horrible ideas about immigrants that we might associate with horrible dictatorial regimes of the past in other countries. And yet, as she points out, there are lots of immigrants who are prepared to vote for that person for president. I'd love to hear what both of you make of the immigration issue and kind of where it's moving the electorate right now.
I grew up in Mexico City, and so because I'm a native Spanish speaker, I speak to Latinos all the time and kind of get, in an anecdotal, Lydia-like sense, kind of get a flavor of some of their views. And what comes across again and again is that the Latino community sees itself as an aspirational working class community, not actually necessarily as a demographic cultural block. And there's a great deal of variety within the Latino community. So for instance, if you've come out of Venezuela, right? And with an idea of what socialism means, you might gravitate towards the Republican Party in ways that might be surprising, given that the Republican candidate is saying that, you know, you're all bad people from you know, connected to drug gangs. And I think that there's a danger when we talk about immigration that we speak about it in this kind of broad way without noticing that the Latino community is an incredibly diverse community with very, very different political experiences, different experiences of immigration. Established Latino communities in South Texas, for instance, chat with them, and they're some of the most hard line when it comes to the subject of border control, because their lived experience, to use that term, is of a mass migration issue which brings genuine social problems, stresses on public schools and communities. So there's a kind of a 30,000-foot view that I think some of us in the media are we're in danger of seeing issues that way. It really helps journalistically just to talk to people and get a sense of, well, what is it that they're thinking? What is it they want from America? Why do they find themselves responding to Donald Trump's appeal? You know, and you hear things, it's machismo, it's the feeling that he's an American who made it, whatever, a whole variety of reasons. But we just have to think about this in a much more nuanced way. Just one small additional point. I think, and I can't believe I'm saying this given my politics, but like we have kind of forsaken a good old-fashioned Marxist analysis of the election, which is that class matters a lot more than other markers of identity, or may matter a lot more than other markers of identity. And it's something we should be kind of thinking about in terms of not just the election, but the general way in which politics plays out in America.
Say just a little more about that before we move on. What do you mean by that?
I think that, I mean, look, class has always played a hugely important role in politics, but, and again, this is an overgeneralization. I would say the last 20 years especially, in discourse like at the New York Times, we've been paying much more attention to other markers of identity.
Race.
Race,
gender,
ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever, right? And I don't want to say any of those are unimportant, gender, of course, being another big one. But class really, really matters. And one of the things Trump said in 2016, which deserved more attention than he got, is he said, remember, it's the Republican Party, not the Conservative Party. So the Republican Party's identity, he went on to say, could shift, and he was asked, this was by our colleague David Sanger, well, how would it shift? He said, I see the Republican Party in a few years' time being a working man's party. And that's kind of exactly what he's done, at least in terms of the coalition that he has assembled. You might say the policies don't benefit the working class, but that's increasingly the source of his appeal. One tiny additional point. This is, again, a gross generalization, but why not?
Grosser the better.
Yeah. Not a vulgar generalization, just a gross one. In a crude sense, you can divide this country into a part of the country that operates in the economy of words and another part that operates in the economy of stuff, right? We're all in the words business. Our job is to deliberate over commas or produce papers. Lawyers, academics, journalists, a whole universe of people who are in the words business. And then there's a stuff economy, moving, UPS guys, people moving stuff from here to A to B, or real estate, whatever it is, construction. And Trump has captured the stuff economy. And those of us in the words economy need to know more about daily life in the stuff economy.
Yeah. That reminds me of The outcome in 2016 here in Michigan, which of course was a surprise, everyone believed that Hillary Clinton would win Michigan and thus win the presidency. She didn't, and one of the reasons she didn't was a county called Macomb County, which is just to the northeast of Detroit, a very blue-collar part of the state that has been largely Democratic for a long time. It first went for Republican presidential candidate in the 1980s. That's where the term Reagan Democrats came from, was Macomb County. That happened again in 2016, and it was a very similar dynamic that drove them there, and it was about that working class element of their lives. And I remember lots of people calling me from other places after that, asking, well, what happened in Michigan? How did this happen? And I said, I think a lot, Macomb County had a lot to do with it. And I had to admit that as a Detroiter, as somebody who lives in this word economy, as you point out, I just didn't know enough about the people there. I hadn't spent enough time with people in Macomb County to be able to explain to outsiders what was on their minds. What are they thinking about? What are they fearful about? What are they hopeful about? And I've tried in the last 8 years to spend more time with them and in their communities, trying to learn more about it. And it is, you're absolutely right. There is a fundamental shift kind of happening there, and it involves not just class, but also race and immigration and all kinds of other things that are going on in the county. Lydia.
Yeah.
Let's go to
Sorry,
Lydia
go
and then Vince.
I was just gonna, yeah. I mean, I think when I think about what is immigration, right? What is migration? I really think of it, and I mean, my mother is from Ethiopia. She ended up coming to the United States via marrying my dad, who's American. He was an exchange student, and she wasn't someone who had aspired to come to the United States necessarily. So her story is maybe a little bit atypical, but I think, immigration is almost always a story about the future, right? About seeking something and coming from a place where you, maybe you're forced to leave that place. Maybe that place doesn't offer the things that you think you need in order to thrive as a human being, to have the kind of future that you want. But it's ultimately it's a future-oriented act, and it's been really fascinating to see. The rise of Donald Trump and a story about America that is just so past-oriented, Make America Great Again. It was great before, and now we're going to bring it back, and it's that whole blue-collar job, very male, very stuff-oriented. And I think all of that is completely understandable, right? Because I think what's missing in the United States is some vision of what the future that people might participate in, a future of growth and dynamism and what that might look like, that will bring along everyone, right? Rather than being some sort of zero-sum competition. I think people who migrate to this country see that possibility and want to be a part of it. I think that there are lots of people who are in this country who look at those people and say, okay, that person's coming to take away the thing that that should be mine, or that in some chain reaction way, they're going to diminish the size of the pie, that we're all going to have to share amongst ourselves. And these ideas of like my youth of, interdependence, of, dynamism and growth, and, you start to, and as a person who's broadly on the left, these are discredited kind of capitalist ideas that I shouldn't be talking about any more than Bret should be talking about Marxist ideas. But I do think that this orientation to the past and it's really depressing. It's like it feels like a dead end. And one of the things that I'm feeling in this election, that I'm craving, that I'm frankly not seeing from Kamala Harris, is some kind of positive story about moving forward together, dynamism, growth, opportunity, and I think that that's not a problem that's unique to the United States. I think that, whether they're on the center left or the center right, parties and politicians in countries across the rich world, I think, are struggling to tell a story about the future that doesn't feel like just a bunch of lies, to somebody whose blue-collar job is gone. So yeah, I don't know. That's my.
If I could say,
go ahead.
To me, the most tragic thing about this whole thing with immigration being a big issue in the United States is that it's based on lies, on misinformation and disinformation, and there's so much of it. Beginning with, we have an open border policy. There is no open border policy. There has never been an open border policy. That there are millions of undocumented immigrants that have come in here. I don't use the word illegal because no human being is illegal. So that are all these millions of undocumented immigrants that have come into the country. No, they are asylum seekers, and it is legal to request asylum. Are there more coming in now than before? Yes. Why? Were they less then? Yeah, we were in a pandemic, and they had Title 42, which would not allow anyone to cross the border because we were in the middle of a health crisis. When that health crisis ended and Title 42 was lifted, the border remained closed, but eventually they had to not close it completely and begin to allow asylum seekers to request asylum because they're legally allowed to. Not just that, but there were hundreds if not thousands of people at the border waiting for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and the rest of the world was in upheaval. So of course more people are going to try to come into the US. Whenever you have a rich country next to a poor country, people are going, no matter where it is, whether it's in Europe or in any continent, that's what's going to happen. So I don't think that Democratic Party has done a good job in defending their position and sort of like, clearing up some of these lies. One of the most recent ones, there's 13,000 murders that are in the country that they say, well, I think that's the number, right? That Vice President Harris has allowed to come in. Well, that report happens to be 13,000 in the last 40 years, not since the Biden administration began. So there's a lot of lies, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And when you talk about mass deportations, why aren't they talking about what that would mean? Not just financially what it would mean, but just how much this country depends on immigrants. There are industries that depend on immigrant labor force, the construction industry, the agricultural industry, and immigrants give so much more than what they take. Yeah. So, there's just so many lies that are out there, and there is no one there to fact check them.
Push back, yeah.
Push
Go
back.
ahead, Vince, and then Bret.
Yeah, so I feel a little out of place on this panel in the sense that I don't have a very pithy anecdote to tell about a cab driver or a neighbor.
You spend all your days with numbers.
So I'm not in a position
numbers.
to speak to that issue, but what I am in a position to speak to is kind of a bird's eye view about elections and how demographic groups vote, et cetera. So I'll try to be brief here. There are really just two main points I want to make about the continuity of how people vote and about the relevant cleavages that are most likely to drive vote choice. We don't have to speculate about this. We actually know as political scientists. So the first point is that I don't pretend to know what's going to happen in November for all the reasons we've already talked about this evening, but I'm fairly confident that the ways in which different salient demographic groups vote will not be dramatically different than it was in 2020 or 2016 or, for that matter, 2000. There may well be shifts, and those shifts may be sufficiently consequential to decide the outcome, but the notion that there will be dramatic changes, that some group of voters are moving towards one party or another, it's way too soon to know that. We simply don't know that. There's already variability in any election cycle. So I think it's a mistake to suggest that we know that voters of this characteristic or another are moving in one direction or another. The other point I want to make quickly is that I agree that class is a factor that drives vote choice, but we know from a variety of studies over decades that far and away the most salient social cleavage that drives vote choice is race. And second to race would be religion, mostly in the terms of religiosity. Gender and class are meaningful, in part because of the size of those particular demographically defined groups. But the differences between how people, based on their class identities or their gender identities, vote is dwarfed relative to race, ethnicity, and religion.
So are you saying, I mean, I want you to qualify that a little bit for us and say, if you're just trying to predict how we would vote up here on the panel, you'd be more likely to be right just looking at the color of our skin and our ethnic background than thinking about what we do for a living or the experiences we've had in other ways.
Yes.
Yes, really?
You probably would be right.
Can I respond in the spirit of slight disagreement with María Elena? You know, one of the reasons why demagoguery works is that demagogues don't traffic in lies, they traffic in half-truths. And people who oppose the demagogue notice the lie, you know, Haitians eating cats in Ohio, or whatever the lie of the day is. But other people put that aside and say, yeah, but there's a deeper truth, right? And in fact, there is a deeper truth. If you look at social services in New York City, they are extraordinarily strained by the arrival of tens of thousands of migrants from Latin America. There's no doubt that there was an enormous surge. We really don't know the numbers of people crossing the border, not just encounters at the border, but then coming into this country. Public schools, you hear it in Chicago, you hear it in metropolitan areas, you hear it in rural areas in Maine, are being strained by the arrival of new people. And what bothers people about this isn't necessarily the question of, well, are these immigrants going to work out, because we know many of them do work out and are incredible contributors to society. The issue is control. I would say that if there's a single decisive issue, and again, I'd be delighted to be proved wrong on this, this election is going to go Republican at the presidential level because Trump, whatever his other sub-messages, promises to be the agent of control. I think today people feel that there's something slightly out of control. We don't know how many migrants are crossing. We don't know where the world is going. Ukraine, Gaza, China, all of it feels like there is a control aspect that's missing. And I think that's what a lot of voters are responding to in this election cycle. We might look back at it and say that that was in fact the issue. Hopefully not, but that's another story.
In control, like Fidel Castro was in control, like Hugo Chavez was in control, like Maduro.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about Trump's view of the world. I'm talking about the perception of some critical number of voters who feel that on a number of indices, control, predictability in their communities, in their world, in terms of what they're seeing on the news, that there's not enough of it. And in cases like that, the instinct, and again, I'm speaking in gross generalizations, but the instinct is to go to the candidate who seems to be, although I see him as a chaos agent, seems to be the agent of, I'm going to be the mano fuerte, the heavy-handed guy who gets things in order.
Well, and I think that people are not necessarily, I mean, people are not rational actors, right? I mean, people aren't making like decisions based on a careful study of, you know, facts or history or whatever. I think that a lot of the decisions that people make about these things are just based on how they feel. You know, I mean, we've published so many focus groups and things with people who were just like, you know, like when Trump was president, like my car payment was less, you know, my, you know, a carton of eggs was less. I mean, all of those things are true, by the way, right? But like, there's a lot of other stuff that goes into it that is extremely salient to like, you know, the state of the world. But I think that like this idea that you can somehow by returning to some period of the past, have that sense of mastery and control because it's a place we've been before, rather than this scary, hazy future that no one seems to be pointing us a clear direction to, I think is quite comforting, right? It's not hard to see why people would grasp for that in a moment like this. And I mean, I live in New York City, that it's so safe, right? Like, but I also know that it's scary to see, like unhoused people, homeless people who are mentally ill on the streets. You're walking your dog and somebody screams at you. I mean, it's just things like that do create that feeling of disorder that has nothing to do with statistics. It has nothing to do with and I think that people have these feelings of things being out of control and reach for something, and that thing is usually something in the past because.
Yeah. It's almost as if Kamala Harris needed to adopt more of that language and sort of outward projection about the certainty that Donald Trump
I'm
projects.
reliably told that she has a Glock, so.
Right? She did say
what's
that.
interesting, I think that I think everyone might have forgotten that she's been a candidate for 3 months.
True.
And it's incredible that
It's a big
in
problem
3
with the
months
process,
it's
right?
50-50 and not less than that, and that he's not more ahead. He's been campaigning for 8 years. Joe Biden was campaigning for I don't know how long, and she's been campaigning for basically 3 months. So, that's a big accomplishment to even be at 50-50 right now.
But this entire conversation, we've been talking for an hour, and we've talked almost exclusively about Donald Trump,
Yes.
right? I mean, it's he creates the weather, that is the context in which, forgive me, in which we exist, and hopefully someday won't, but yeah.
All right, so it was my job to structure and wrangle this conversation, and I think I'd give myself a gentleman's C. But that's higher than most of the grades I got when I was an undergrad here. But we're supposed to move now to questions. I am hoping that some of the questions from the audience will fill in some of the blanks where we just didn't get to things, including the economy, which I think I'm hopeful someone will ask about that. But our first question is actually coming from a student here at the university, María Courtois. She is right here in the audience.
Yes, hi. Thank you all for speaking. It was a very thought-provoking discussion. So I'm María Courtois. I'm a poli-sci graduating in May. And I'm a co-president of Turn Up Turnout, which was mentioned at the very beginning before the panelists came out. But we're the student group in the UMich Votes Coalition. And so my question, obviously I'm a student, so I interact with students all the time, whether it's through voter registration or our Dinners for Democracy, which kind of get at what you guys were doing today, but with free food, or just in my classes. And so my question is, how do you encourage students to participate in democracy, seeing as a lot of them are disillusioned just with the electoral process in general, but also seeing as for many students it's their first time voting in a presidential election?
Great question.
Go ahead.
To say, when my stepdaughter, who's now herself a PhD and a professor at a university, but when she turned 18, I said, "Oh, great, you can vote now. How exciting!" She says, "Vote? Why would I want to vote? I don't know anything about voting." Then she started taking journalism classes, and living up in Tallahassee, she began to realize, oh, elections affect me as a student. And it wasn't until then that she realized how important it was. I know that kids don't get excited about candidates, but sometimes they get excited about issues. I think what I would tell them is the same thing that I have told people throughout my whole career, because in Spanish language media we do a lot of voter registration and get out the vote campaigns, is don't let someone else decide for you. And if you can vote and you don't, then you don't have the moral authority to complain. So don't complain. You can't complain. If you vote, then you can complain. If you don't vote, then you can't complain. So.
I think it'd be really great also to for people to think about getting involved and at like a much more local and grassroots level, because I think that I find national politics really depressing, and in particular, we've been through this whole joy, euphoria, blah 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 with the Harris campaign, and I think then a lot of disillusionment and disappointment, particularly among young people, because we live in the real world and that's what happens. But I think there's something really valuable to being exposed to movements, whether they're in politics or social movements and things like that are just really close to home. You build relationships to issues, to people that are really meaningful and help you understand what it is to build change from the ground up. And that's very hard to see, when you're talking about a presidential election. So it's perhaps a cliche, but I think starting local is a good way to get people excited about voting.
Just one quick point. I mean, my advice to you and to your class, your generation, is cultivate the habits of a free mind. And that is listen, be curious, ask questions, expose yourself to points of view that you're not immediately sympathetic to. The worst that can happen is that it's going to sharpen your argument. I mean, there's a certain advantage in my case of being a conservative writer at the New York Times, which is that I bathe in ideas that I'm not instinctively sympathetic to. And it turns out, I think it makes me a better columnist because I need to think more deeply about how people on another side of an issue might come at it, and it forces me also to meet a largely liberal readership more or less where they are. So I have to argue my priors a little more carefully than I used to when I worked at a conservative editorial page. I think there's something really healthy about it, and at its best, it's actually enjoyable. A good argument can be mutual and frictional and generative, like good something else, and that's a good thing. And I feel like we live in a world where everyone is in their respective silos, listening more or less to echoes of people who are just mirroring their thoughts. That's unhealthy for democracy. To encounter difference in all kinds of ways, including differences of views, is a profoundly enriching experience, and you're at a university where hopefully you can do that.
I'll just echo all that my colleagues here on the panel have said. I agree with all of that. And in terms of, obviously, I interact with undergraduates all the time, and I don't have a secret in terms of how to get them to participate in elections beyond the advice you've already heard. And I guess I would say, in addition to that, to remind your peers, your fellow students, and young people more broadly, that elections are not about the personalities who happen to be running. So maybe just remind them of the stakes, whatever direction that may drive them. So it's not about liking how someone looks on TV or the personality associated with a particular candidate. It's about the issues that he or she is associated with and will champion. And democracy is supposed to be about a clash of ideas and interests, not about personalities.
I would just kind of piggyback on something Bret was talking about in terms of the open mind and debate and curiosity. We're at the University of Michigan, and one of the things that concerns me about the difference between campus now and when I was a student is how far it feels like the academic infrastructure here has moved away from encouraging that and welcoming it. That is not just something you should be doing as an extracurricular on the weekends. It is something you should be experiencing in the classroom all the time, and the university should be pushing students to do that. I think it's something that we have lost a little bit of here. So questions, there are microphones in both of the aisles. If you have a question,
hello,
get in the queue.
Wonderful. Hola, I'm Lorena Chambers. I am a postdoc here at the University of Michigan, but I've also been a political consultant for over 25 years. This is my 5th presidential election. And it seems to me that throughout the conversation, which I enjoyed a lot, there is a missing ingredient, which is the line of misogyny at the presidential level. Like, why is it that this notion of control that one candidate seems to dictate, according to you, Bret, but we haven't talked about the effect and also the relationship that this kind of language is up against 2 women, right? It was Hillary Clinton in 2016, and now Kamala Harris, a woman of color. And so what is it that is missing in this conversation, right? This line of misogyny. I know because this is my 12th cycle in Nevada, and I've helped elect 2 senators, one Latina, and now Jackie Rosen, hopefully. We have strong senators, we used to have strong senators from California. So that level of the US Senate is not so much shaped because it's also individually done by a state. But when you average this out nationally, then because of the Electoral College, that's where we have these few and very minimal numbers that are tipping the Electoral College according to each state. Anyway, so I'd love to hear your conversation and thoughts about this line of misogyny and anti-woman sentiment for our presidential candidates that happen to be women.
How much of the election do you feel is about gender? The fact that Kamala Harris would be the first woman and first African-American woman and Indian woman elected to the presidency.
But it does seem, I remember in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, I did hear a lot of people talk about, no, I don't want to vote for her, she's a woman, she's weak. I haven't heard that much this time. I think the support from women toward Kamala Harris comes from her positions, reproductive rights and other issues that women are supporting, and that's why they're leaning toward her. It's interesting how she hasn't brought up her gender or her race in this campaign. She doesn't talk about that at all. So I don't know what you think, but I don't know that plays such a big role in this election as some of the other things that we have mentioned.
You know, it's interesting, because as you were talking, I think that, we can't deny the fact that the United States has never had a female president. Like, that's just a fact, right? And, like the year of the woman in the Senate was, 1992, which was, like my junior year of high school. So not that long ago. I'm not that old. So, clearly there's something there. One of the things that's, I think, really kind of extraordinary, though, about Trump is, like, his ability to kind of, like, position people as weak, but, in some ways, like, tell this sort of half-truth that Bret was talking about. I actually think that one of the reasons that really the main reason that Joe Biden had to leave the race was because he was weak, right? He was old. He couldn't stand up for himself, for his administration on the debate stage. And there is perhaps a kind of gendered aspect to that, but I think that there was this sense that, like, this is an administration of, like, weakness rather than strength, that maybe it was a way of kind of gendering Joe Biden, I don't know, or, like, making him effeminate in some way. But I think that in this particular race, it's also been interesting the way that Kamala Harris, as a black woman, and black women's femininity is read very differently than white women's femininity is, and the expectation that one has of it. So I think it's a very complex stew that's very hard to parse in this particular race. And I hope that Kamala Harris wins. But if she doesn't, I don't know that we'll necessarily look back and say that her gender was a decisive factor in it. Maybe we will. I don't know, but I think that it's part of a much bigger kind of stew of psychological stuff.
This side, yeah.
Great. First, I want to say thank you so much for this beautifully informative dialogue that you've had for us today. My name is Valeria Morales. I'm an undergrad student pursuing political science and communications with an intent to go into news journalism, broadcast journalism. So my question is primarily for María Elena Salinas, because you are a broadcast journalist, and this is kind of more towards you, but also to the other journalists that are on the panel. First, I just want to say that watching you grow up, your programas on Univision are one of the main reasons why I even found this passion and decided to pursue it in the first place. So I'm absolutely humbled to be asking you this question. So I just want to hear you speak a little bit about the impact of namely broadcast journalism on election cycles. As you said, you've covered 12 elections? 10 US elections in your career, and that's obviously a lot. So how have you seen the impact shift in previous years, and increasingly as we move on with this increased distrust in the media and this narrative that's being pushed that media outlets, aren't for the people and have their own agendas? And this era of discouragement among young and aspiring journalists with this increasing distrust. Just speak on what you think that means for the future and the differences that you've noticed.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Thank you so much for the question. About the mistrust in the media, there's several reasons. Some of it is our own doing, but a lot of it has to do also with the rhetoric. And usually what you see, remember, our job is to seek the truth and tell the truth, to denounce injustice and uncover corruption. I mean, that's our main job as journalists. And what you see in autocratic governments and in authoritarian governments, one of the first things that they do is try to silence the media. In places like Cuba, maybe they put you in jail, or in Mexico they kill you, or in Venezuela they shut you down, or they try to discredit you by saying that you are the enemy of the people. So part of that has to do with the rhetoric from politicians. But then again, I think it's part of our doing. I mean, I would vouch for Univision, ABC, CBS, NBC. I trust the networks more because I've worked in the networks, and it's not like we have someone telling us, you have to say this, you have to say that, you have to take this position, you have to take that position. So maybe with 24-hour news, that kind of changed, because then they started going one direction and the other. And people no longer were able to distinguish between news and commentary, and who is giving me the news and the facts, and who is giving me their opinion. And that is another one of the reasons that has led to the lack of trust. But I mean, I think that the media plays a huge role. It plays a huge role in perceptions. And I'm sorry to go back to the topic of immigration again, but if what you see in mainstream media, and by mainstream I mean English language media, if what you're seeing that the coverage of immigration is always the border, and crisis at the border, then the perception of those who don't know the Latino community is going to be, oh, I'm going to equate Latinos with a crisis at the border. So that's not what you see at Univision, of course. But they're not telling the positive stories. They're not telling the success stories. They're only reporting on the negative. And like they say, what if it bleeds, it leads. And good news is no news. Is that what the saying is, or something like that? So yeah, I think the media does play a role. What's it going to be in the future? I mean, you tell me, because I really think that young people are going to reinvent the way that we do news. I truly believe that. And you can improve it too.
This side.
Yeah, thank you. This is super interesting because I am a journalist myself. I'm from Italy, and I'm reporting about the US elections from Michigan for an Italian outlet. And I want to bring back this conversation to the very first point when Bret Stephens, but also María Salinas said that this is an unhappy race in an unhappy country and no one wants to talk about politics anymore. This is something that resonates also abroad, where we see decreasing interest in US politics, while in the past we had the whole world watching what was going on in Washington and the outcomes from the other countries. So I was wondering, how do we reverse this trend? Is there like room for revert the processes and bring US politics more closer to the people and to the people that are going to vote? Or is just something that is going worsening from electoral cycle to electoral cycle? Thank you.
Look, the answer is I don't know, but one thing I would say is, you know, there is a history in the United States of arriving at moments of what seem to be intractable politics, deep stagnation, and a great deal of pessimism. And eventually some kind of sunshine breaks through, in part because this country has, I think, reserves of innovation, including political innovation, dynamism, that again and again surprise people. Nobody had heard of Barack Obama in 2002. In 2008, he was giving speeches to audiences of hundreds of thousands of people in Berlin. And so we have a history, and you can go back to previous presidencies as well, to see that of surprising ourselves. You know, there's a paradox in democratic life, which is that democracies, by their very nature, obsess about their defects and forget about their strengths and virtues. By contrast, autocracies advertise their strengths and virtues and try to hide their defects. But eventually, the strengths emerge. If you look back at the 1970s and were to have a conversation about politics 50 years ago, 1974, there would be deep pessimism in the wake of Vietnam, Watergate, Ford's pardon of Nixon, all kinds of things that made it seem like this country was at the end of its rope. Now, in retrospect, we look back and say, gosh, the 1970s were an era of incredible dynamism, technologically and in other innovations. Most of the great companies that now define the 21st century emerged from the 1970s, whether it was Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Larry Ellison, a whole number of other entrepreneurs. There was ferment, but it was happening where nobody was looking. So I wouldn't write off America quite yet, even if this election cycle is maybe not as energizing as others have been.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Robert Schwartz. I'm the Michigan director of an organization called Nikki Haley Voters for Kamala Harris. And I was actually very interested in this comment of like shifting demographics, particularly in Michigan, because we see you know, what you talked about in Macomb County with more working class, in particular white working class, moving to the Republican candidate. And then in Wayne County this particular year, you know, with Gaza and the uncommitted movement, you have a movement also away from the Democrat. And then the countervailing pressure is this movement of some of these traditional GOP strongholds of Oakland County, Detroit suburbs, Kent County, Grand Rapids suburbs, Gerald Ford, you know, area. But so the question is really, because you talked about the small demographic changes over time, how do those forces play out, I guess, in Michigan and also more broadly in the country, where you have same thing in like Atlanta suburbs of some of these traditionally suburban, educated people of words, I guess, moving towards the Democrats and more of the people in the stuff economy moving towards moving towards the Republicans.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'll run that risk nonetheless. I think we should be very cautious about X group moving towards this party or that party. We're talking about one election cycle, and it's just too soon to know. It is, you know, for the last 60 plus years, white Americans nationally have voted for the Republican, in the majority, they voted for the Republican presidential candidate, and I expect that's going to be true in 2024. And for longer even than that, but even more so at supermajority levels, African Americans have voted for the Democratic candidate And I expect that's going to happen in 2024 as well. So all the movement that all the ink is being spilled about regarding who's moving where and under what circumstances is what we would say at the margins. There is no dramatic movement of social groups that we can discern at this stage.
Right, but I'll just quick follow-up. In a state like Michigan, those margins are,
They
were
could
the
make a
difference
difference.
between 2016 and 2020. So which margins are larger, I guess, even though they're small?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. The elections are won and lost at the margin. So my point is not that it's not consequential. My point is that this idea that we know where groups are moving, I think we should be cautious about that.
Yeah. We do have questions that are being sent by QR code to Sarah Rahal, who is right there. Is there a good question next, Sarah?
There's a lot of good questions. We haven't touched on the topic of foreign interference in this election. The NSA has been warning that foreign entities are using social media to confuse our discourse. How much of our division comes from these external forces that do not have our best interests at heart? And this is from Andy Hoffman, who's a faculty here.
Great question. No one wants to field that one.
It has felt. I feel like I'm going to give a very anecdotal answer, and I'd be curious for someone who's studied this more closely. I think that, and this is maybe not a popular view, that like misinformation and disinformation is less powerful and important than just people wanting to believe what they want to believe, and that if you put something in front of somebody that sort of taps into their previously held view and has enough of a ring of truth to it, then I think people are have a good chance of being moved by it. But I think that that's happening, right here at home with actors right here at home. I mean, we spent all this time, trying to figure out whether Donald Trump was an agent of the Russian government, and maybe someday the CIA files will be declassified, and we'll find out for sure. But I think we're so good at creating our own crazy conspiracies that I'm not sure how much help we need from abroad. But again, this is not something I've written about extensively. So,
This side now.
Yes. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to all the panelists for this conversation. Definitely talking about immigration as well as class, race, in terms of how we vote, as well as the leading decisions for how we vote too. My question is for any of the panelists that want to speak to this. It's regarding COVID, as well as now we're moving towards post-COVID, as well as the policies itself that may have created the polarization of people to lead to their voting methods. I'll first say, I think the median age over here or within the room is pretty significantly high, and I think healthcare is a thing that we don't necessarily discuss or have a huge, how can I say this? I don't think Americans talk enough about healthcare, as well as not being able to receive both the benefits as well as being able to cover themselves through different acts like the Medicaid or Medicare. And I know also in rural communities, they don't have access or they don't have enough knowledge on the policies that affect them directly. Any thoughts or conversation regarding healthcare and how we can move forward to honestly either A, have better policies, moving post-COVID, or B, how do we have this conversation amongst all of our different communities to say healthcare is still important, as well as we need to figure out why it's still a lot of dysfunction across the nation?
Yeah.
I think it's such a great question. I mean, there's a famous anecdote, apparently, when Henry Kissinger met with Zhou Enlai in China in 1970. Kissinger sort of pompously asked Zhou, what do you think the effects of the French Revolution were? And Zhou said, well, it's too soon to tell. This was now 180 years after the fact. And I feel, to some extent, it's way too soon to tell exactly how those 3 years of COVID will affect the country. But my sense is it was much more profound than many of us who sort of said, okay, well, we're just going to stay at home and put a mask on when we go to the supermarket and work remotely. Many of us appreciate. I mean, I know that for my children who went through it, and so many people's children or grandchildren, it had a profound effect. But I think one area which you touched on is that it further diminished trust in institutions. If you look, for instance, I think it's Gallup does trust in institutions poll, and trust for science was always very high, and it has come down significantly since 2022. And lots of agents that help explain that loss of trust, including, going back to the previous question, a great deal of misinformation out there. But I would also add that in too many cases, at least, and this is a personal view, in too many cases, the faces of the public health agencies let the public down because they mistook the interests of public health for the public interest itself, and they're not one and the same. Public health is part of the public interest, but there are a broader set of interests, and that, I think, did a lot of damage to the way in which we look at these once sacrosanct institutions. I think they turbocharged a whole variety of conspiracy theories. I think they made it more difficult to have rational conversations about public policy, and I think these effects will be with us for decades.
I just want to add that I think that COVID made things worse. I think politics got in the way. And we were already polarized by then, and then it became worse. Now everything is politicized, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the vaccine, whether it's music, art, I mean, you name it, everything is now politicized. And I think it just made things so much worse. People agreeing and not agreeing whether we should wear masks or whether the kids should go to school, and things like that. I just recently interviewed Javier Becerra, who is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we talked about that in underserved communities and how are they helping people post-COVID. And I don't know if people are not getting the message, but he did say that one of the things that they've been doing is meeting people where they are, because there were so many rural communities during the pandemic and post the pandemic that didn't have access to health care, and they realized that they needed to go there to them, and that they have a lot of different teams all over the country trying to reach those communities, those rural communities where they are. In my case, I was asking him specifically about the Latino communities and some of the farm workers, things like that. And he said that they are going out and reaching them. But one of the things that was getting in the way is the mistrust. And so, unfortunately, I think politics and the division that politics created exacerbated our tragedy of the pandemic.
We have time for just one more question. It's going to be on this side.
Hi, my name is Macy Wilcox. I'm a second-year undergraduate student here. I'm actually studying English and secondary education, so not directly related to political science, but I'm currently in a film class about fascist media and how that has been observed in the past. And so based on what we've been talking about in that class and how politics is such a slippery slope, it was mentioned earlier that many people are voting based on charisma rather than with informed knowledge, which is a staple a lot of times of the beginnings of a fascist government. And I was just wondering how you think that this contributes to the sort of us versus them rhetoric that's been increasingly prominent since the 2016 election.
Where Bret used to work.
According to some people, I am the fascist media. I don't know, Lydia, do you have thoughts on this?
Please.
This is a tough
look, democracies are not strangers to charismatic politics. John F. Kennedy was a charismatic politician. Barack Obama was a charismatic politician. I don't think they're anyone's definition of fascism, and actually, there's a lot to be said for charisma in politics. The problem with fascism is when you want to muzzle your opponents and send them to concentration camps. That's when we really start to worry. You know, but here's what I worry about, and I'm going to take your question in a completely different direction. This actually goes to something the gentleman whose club I could belong to, Nikki Haley voters for Kamala. What I worry about in this election is this. In every society, there is going to be a conservative movement. Even in Mao's China, there was a conservative faction, you name it. And there's an important question about whether that is going to be a healthy conservative movement that believes ultimately in the liberal order, liberal in the broadest sense, or one that fundamentally rejects it, whose conservatism is really a form of blood and soil illiberalism. And you know, what made up my mind in this election was my profound fear that we are moving in a direction in which we no longer have a conservative party in this country that still believes in the basic tenets of a liberal constitutional order. And that frightens me. And when you marry that to a weirdly charismatic leader, and B, a media apparatus that is set up to support him and deify him no matter what he says, you are in a zone of trouble. And that's what concerns me these days.
Bret, you always bring the sunshine. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you all so much. I just want to close us out by saying to all of you, thank you for coming. Anyone who works with me knows that I have been nervous all day that for the first time Wallace House would have an event with no one here because of election fatigue. That we all feel it, that you turn on your radio, you turn on your TV, you pick up your phone and just feel this sense of tension and anxiety and dread. And I just wasn't sure that people would want to come into a space to talk about these things. But I think what your presence here tonight and what the quality of this conversation, all of the people on the stage, our friends and colleagues, what the quality of the conversation reinforces is the reason that Wallace House does these public events, and you can read it on our website, is that that we think it's important to bring people up out of our devices and into public spaces where we can be talking together, where we have to look at each other and think about what we say, not just type something with our thumbs and hit send. And I actually feel better than I felt this morning. Because I think we're in the presence of other people and we're talking about some of the things that make us anxious out loud together. And Vince, I just want to say, because you said early in the conversation that you were a little bit of a fish out of water, you are not ever a fish out of water at Wallace House or with journalists, that if you come to our events often, you know that we always have faculty members with the journalists we invite. And I want to thank Jim and Wendy House again for encouraging this, because we can't underscore enough that these institutions, journalism, higher education, science broadly, are facing threats right now of trust and confidence. And so being able to sit here and listen to a conversation of this quality and depth, there are a lot of things we didn't get to. I think, I don't know, I wish we maybe had started an hour earlier. But it was, I'm really so thankful to all of you for coming and all of you. And the last thing I would say to our students who were outside with turn up, turn out, no matter how fatigued you are, please, and if you're in this room, I probably don't need to tell you this, remember to vote. and tell the people in your lives to remember to vote. So Bret, Lydia, María, Elena, Vince, Stephen, and Stephen, you did an excellent job of wrangling this crew. Thank you so much.